Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming. And it's a great privilege for me to have these eminent panelists with me for this discussion of the missing canon. And thank you to our MCs for those lovely introductions. And that's where I'd like to start. So even though our MCs told us what a canon is, I'm going to ask our panelists their idea, if they can extend the idea of what they consider a canon, because it's very important that we understand what a canon is before we start talking about any missing canons. So I'll start with Katie. Katie, very simple question. What is a canon, according to you?
Values. It's a collection that a culture thinks should be passed on to children. So we usually would say, if I'm a school librarian, then my library should contain all the books that the teachers and the parents want the kids to be exposed to.
Teacher, there were certain books that we were expected to teach depending on what course we were teaching, and I taught a course in the core curriculum in Cairo where we were supposed to pick the great books that all of our students must read before they graduate from university. Now, of course, it was all dictated by the fact that we had 14 weeks in the semester, so we could only pick 14 books, and it was a real challenge. At one point, I think I thought to myself that this is a completely pointless exercise, but on the other hand, in retrospect, having as a teacher had to read those 14 particular books, I'm grateful to somebody for having chosen them, because I certainly wouldn't have chosen some of them and I wouldn't have discovered what they contained.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm coming back to you, Stephen. To what extent do you think it's accurate to say that Indian children's writing or Indian children's literature has a missing canon? Do you think the canon is missing?
Well, it's certainly the title of our panel discussion, so something must be missing. But at the same time, I think that I would like to think of it more as an emerging canon. And as I was saying earlier in our conversation, I'm old enough to remember when it was possible to say that I have read all of the books in English written by Indian authors. There was a very limited list back in the 60s. You had wonderful writers like R.K. Narayan, Anita Desai, Khushwant Singh, but frankly, you could name them all and pretty much be able to have covered the lot of them. Today, that's impossible with adult fiction or nonfiction. I think with children's literature, we're at a point where we're moving beyond that. Right now, we could probably, everyone will name Ruskin Bond, people will name Paro Anand, others, but I think that list is going to grow to the point where then the canon will have to be established, because there are so many that you have to make choices and pick.
To ask Devika something, because Devika works in a very interesting corner of Indian children's writing. And when we think of the canon, we usually think of novelists. But there's a separate field of nonfiction. And in nonfiction, there's a separate niche for academics, experts in a field, who make things accessible to children. And that's the kind of work that Devika does. She's written on archaeology. She was a practicing archaeologist and continues to do research work. And so my question to Devika is, in your corner, do you think there is a canon? And before we even go there, to what extent is there an actual body of work from which a canon can emerge in the field that you are looking at?
I think specialists are wary of writing for the general public, for the wider public, for a number of reasons. And there's a very rare set of them who know how to translate very complex concepts into simple language for the lay public. There are wonderful writers in history that I'm familiar with, like Upinder Singh and Nayanjot Lahiri, who do write for a wider reading public. But the segment for children is almost entirely missing. I say almost because there was a book in the 1940s by Percival Spear, a renowned historian, called Delhi and Its Monuments. And it was written specifically for children. It's a wonderful book with his own illustrations, but nothing followed. And I think they're missing a very vital segment of what children like to read. Children would like to have a deeper engagement with subjects like geology, chemistry, botany, deeper than what the school curriculum might offer. But they need the writers, perhaps academic, perhaps specialists, either to collaborate with writers or to write it themselves in a fashion that it would not just tell the story in a simple fashion, but also be attractive for a child or a young reader.
But Devika, do you think there's hope?
Well, I like to think so. I think now that the world of children's publishing in India has sort of exponentially grown, I think this will come about. I'm hopeful.
Katie.
I just wanted to say that narrative nonfiction, which is what you're talking about, worldwide is a really up-and-coming genre, and we're looking for more and more of it, especially for the middle schoolers, for the high schoolers, something between all the information books for the younger children and then adult ones. So I would just encourage you. We are looking for that all the time, we librarians.
Thank you. It has to be a passion, I think, for the specialist and for the author, because only that passion will simplify concepts. It's my experience of writing about archaeology. I think the passion just carried me through. So there is great hope. There are a lot of passionate specialists in India.
That's great to hear. I have a big question now. Those were all the small ones. And this is to all my panelists. You know, given that we have a missing canon, or as Stephen says, we have a developing or an emerging canon, what are the repercussions in your field that you've seen of the absence of a canon or a developing canon for the emerging reading community? You know, by the reading community, I mean students like you, children, teachers, parents, librarians. How do we go about curating, selecting, making decisions if we don't have a canon or we have a very small canon? Perhaps, would you like to start, or Stephen?
Yeah, I would take your question and maybe go a little bit sideways on it, but address it in the sense that I think we all think that we choose the book we read, and that's a choice that we have made ourselves. If we go to a bookstore or we go to a library, we made that choice. What we forget is that a lot of people made choices before that made that book stand in front of you. There was, first of all, an editor that made a choice as to whether it would get published. There's a librarian who chose to purchase that book and put it on the shelf. There are teachers who chose to include it in their reading lists, and so on and so forth. So often we think that we're the ones that made the choice, whereas in fact there are a lot of others who've influenced that choice. And I think that what we're talking about when we're talking about the canon is that influence that brings the reader and the writer together. And I think that happens not by accident. It happens through a lot of very calculated choices. It happens through translation also. There are many books that are totally inaccessible to me because they're written in languages that I can't read. But somebody chose to translate it, then somebody chose to publish it, and I get the pleasure of having it in my hands and reading it. So those choices, and I think the canon, some of them are very formal choices through a syllabus that is dictated by a department in a particular school or whatever it may be. Others are those more indirect choices that are made through the publishing process, through the book selling process, and so on and so forth. I mean, think about who puts the book cover facing out in the bookstore as against the spine facing out. That's a decision that somebody's made. It's a decision that helps you decide which book you want to do. Lots of authors like myself, we go to the bookstore and we take our book out and we put it flat. We cover over the authors that we don't like and we put it there. But these are the things that actually influence why you read a book. And I think it's a fascinating puzzle to me as a writer, but also as a reader.
List and tell you this is the canon. This is somebody's idea of the canon. And so you should go to different bookstores, go to different libraries, look at canons from different countries and different cultures and different languages. And when you put it all together, then you would end up with your own personal list. You know, what would you have? What would you like to teach? Because, yeah, there's no real authority out there.
One factor that's important in the deciding of the canon, we ourselves have our own Neev awards, book awards, which we are going to announce tomorrow. But since Devika has won these awards, I'm going to ask her, what role has these awards made on her writing, and what role do you think they play in the formation of a canon or a body of writing even?
A story or a book, if you will, there is a certain amount of your value system that goes into it. You're trying to get a message across, and the passion that I spoke of, specifically in my field. And you hope that it will receive an empathetic reading from a child, strike a chord. And if someone at the end of that very long and sometimes pretty lonely journey pats you on the back and says, "Well done, you've done a good job, here's a prize," it's quite thrilling, I have to say. As to how it will impact my work in the future, I can't say truly, because I don't think any author sets out with awards in mind. It's just a really nice happenstance. And what was the third part of that question? Whether awards
Yeah, what role do they play in the formation
of a canon?
of a canon?
I think awards in India, children's literary awards, are a very young kind of a phenomenon. So I think there we'll have to wait and watch. But I like to think of awards as a filter of some sort, because the people judging awards are usually, educators, librarians, teachers, journalists, who should be in touch with the sensitivities of an intellectual milieu or a socio-cultural milieu, have a wide exposure to reading, and find something, hold up that book to a very high standard of judging. So in that respect, I think it might work. An award might work as a filter.
Sitting there, the students, do you actually use awards to guide your reading or make a selection?
I might pick it because I feel that if a whole panel has decided that the book is good, I might share the opinion. So usually when I pick up a book that has won an award, I think it's nice after I've read it. So as one of the panelists said, I get to pick a good book and not waste my time.
Thank you. We'll have one more response.
Like an award, because I may like that kind of style of writing that author writes. He may not have won an award, but I like that style of writing. So necessarily when I'm making a canon for myself, I won't pick.
Now, many of us actually watch what's going on in Indian children's writing, but other canons have been formed, are forming, are evolving, or juries and things like that, and you've been associated with us. Do you see any differences in the way the Indian canon of children's writing is being formed compared to the others in your experience?
And Thailand. I've never lived in India. And if I compare the emerging Indian children's literature scene by virtue of the books that I've been reading as part of being on the Neev committee, I can say this is a very robust, emerging field, and I think it's really on the point of exploding. Well, what I want it to do is I want the books to get out of India and be available in these other countries. Singapore is such a small country, and they are desperate they're trying to develop their literature. And they have trouble, they have to, give out cash prizes to be writers. India, there's so many people here writing and wanting to write. I sense there are writers and books trying to get out of India, whereas in Singapore they're trying to encourage it. And in Thailand, it's very difficult. There is very little children's writing going on. And there can be different reasons for that. But I really, really love, first of all, being locked in English. I don't speak any, and I can't read any other languages coming out of India. But you, of course, have so many books in English, so you're a prime candidate for getting out there. And sometimes I think it's frustrating there aren't maybe the selling channels or the publishing channels. I don't know why. I wish I could get, sitting in Bangkok, why can't I just go online, press a button, and get all these books from India sent to me?
To ask you what, and picking up a point that Katie said, what role do you think translation plays in the canon?
Gives out prizes in 22 languages every year. So how many of those will we see in translation? Probably none. Maybe one Hindi to English. But I'm just guessing that bit of it. So there's a huge body of literature. It's a huge country. There are so many people. There are so many writers. But we are bound by, who've been educated in a particular way, are bound by the English language. So I think that is really a missing chunk of our canon. And also, there is a Bengali children's literature that goes back to the early 19th century. There were works of nonsense verse, there was science fiction, there was all sorts of interesting, investigative stories written by Sukumar Roy, Satyajit Ray's family. There were children's magazines, some of which has been translated, but not all, and not all necessarily accessible. So I think that's a huge chunk in Indian children's literature that needs working on, translations.
In a slightly different capacity in canon formation, as an editor, Stephen is also the editor of the Penguin Book of Modern Indian Short Stories. And since editing a work like that involves selection, which is exactly what happens in a canon, I'm going to ask Stephen to talk to us about that process and what did he see getting left out? Was it particular voices? Who gets left out and which subjects, subject matter, and more importantly, genres? And I'll come back to the other panelists as well, especially about genres that get left out in the consideration of a canon. So, Steve.
Editing that particular anthology sort of opened my eyes to all of the problems and challenges of deciding what people should read and what should be left out in that way, because there's a vast number of short stories written, and when you use a heading like modern, you can start almost anywhere and you can end almost anywhere. So it was an interesting process, but part of it was dictated by language, because we did certainly feel that as many different regional languages should be represented as possible. But of course, the decisions were then made on the quality of the work, and in many cases, we could only make the decision based on the quality of the translation. So you've got several filters there already, which make it very difficult. Nevertheless, I think that it was not difficult to determine which was a good story. A good story jumps out at you. If you read it, you know this is it, even if it's poorly translated. And in a couple of instances, we had the stories retranslated so that they flowed more smoothly in English than the original translations. I've also served on the jury for a book award, a couple of book awards over time, and it's the same interesting process in that you can eliminate a large number that are submitted for a book award. And then you're left with often it's referred to as the long list. Sometimes that long list isn't that long, but nevertheless, there are more books than you can give awards to. And then you're left with this challenge, okay, now if I give it to so-and-so, she's already received 6 awards. Why don't we give it to him because he hasn't received any award. You get down to those sort of silly calculations which really have nothing to do with the merits of the book, and that nevertheless enter into the jury's debate. And often with a jury is a wonderful word for this, because they really either they hang you or they put you in prison for life. But nevertheless, one jury member may love a book and will not leave it alone, and you have to sort of persuade that person that, listen, it's not as good as you think it is. There is a better one. But usually you come to an element of consensus. But all of this, I think, comes back to what I was saying earlier, is that these choices are being made, and they're being made out of sight, out of the author's sight, out of the reader's sight. And what brings us together as author and reader is this interesting process and difficult process that's out there. I'd say one more thing, if I may. I always think of writing and reading as being very much a private and a personal activity. A writer, when he or she writes a book, usually does it in solitude, mostly solitude, maybe with a dog lying at your feet, but it's a lonely business. Reading is also a solitary occupation, and that takes place in this sort of private space. What happens outside in terms of the marketing of the book, the promotion of the book, the awards, all of that, that's that public space that's out there. And that's where an element of competition comes in. I like to think writers aren't particularly competitive. We are. We are very competitive. I don't necessarily say, well, Ruskin Bond wrote 1,200 words today, I'm going to write 1,500, or anything like that. But there is this element that's there, and it's part of that public world. So writers are engaged in it, but at the same time, there are choices being made by people who are detached from that reading and writing process, too.
Thanks, Stephen. Left out of a canon, say, subject matter or genres or theme, especially the one that we're looking at in India?
Not just information books. I also sometimes think poetry is just, the neglected child. And that's really a shame. And I worry also that schools maybe teach poetry in ways that don't make kids love it. I wish my students attacked my poetry collection more.
I don't know how that will fit into the canon in terms of what we do today, but it's something to think about. Getting some of that oral tradition into a canon.
We've got plenty of work to do. I think we're almost out of time. And I have questions? Yeah. Yeah, we've got plenty of questions from the audience. I see hands going up there.
Tells quite well to the English books probably than they are doing to the regional language books. So I was just curious about, say, some missing canons that you might be seeing in regional languages if you've had exposure to that space.
So it's it's a neglected segment of our literature, children's literature especially. But as Stephen was describing, there are problems in that segment of quality translation. So I think it should receive some attention now that the forces of the English language market are on the move, so to speak.
Like the Babel fish, from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that we can all just instantly and seamlessly understand other works.
The idea of that plug, I'm not quite sure what's going to be fed. I'm sorry, the question.
About certain canon books that were on the canons, let's say, like To Kill a Mockingbird, pulled off, McCarthyism, all of that. So how we see authors fighting with that or acceding to it. I mean, it's actually a very tricky thing of integrity as well. And that's kind of sad because I think we can still look at economics from that perspective. But yeah, more to the first point. Thank you.
So
controlled, publishers controlled, bookstores controlled, and now people can self-publish. And I always love to hear a good story of somebody whose book got rejected, they self-published, and it really found its audience such that then the traditional publishers come back in and of course want a piece of the pie. And so you can appeal more directly. Well, it's a little bit more chaotic, but I still think it's great potential that we could find. And Marxian economics, it can come back, come on.
So if the jury can't have 100 people, it might have just 12 or something. So then how many books are they going to read? Because there's so many books. So even to get inside the shortlisted books to choose for the canon, then is there another filtering process for that? Because there's so many books.
No, I mean, there's so many books, there's not enough time. There's certainly that is absolutely true. I don't know. I mean, I think the process of selection, I think it's important to find out if a book has won an award or is shortlisted and all of that. But I do urge you, when you pick up a book, read the dust jacket or the flap material on that and make the choice yourself at that point, because that's really where you can make the choice. You don't have to read that book. I mean, your teacher may have told you you have to read that book, but when you're choosing a book for yourself, you should make that choice based on perhaps a knowledge of what someone else has said, but also you've got it in your hands, and you can make some decisions based on how long it is, whether the dust jacket describes it in an interesting way, so many things like, or whether you've read that author before, things like that too.